Okay, so I guess I might as well talk about postcognition and precognition. Postcognition is a thought I had yesterday, based on a conversation that I had with Sync Century, an amazing channel as always, which you should check out, and I'll link in the description. We were talking about different sort of aspects of depression and anxiety, sort of aspects about, let's say, disease in society of a mental kind. Sorry, my shoe. So the idea, I guess, that we were talking about is how depression seems to have to do. Okay, I'll try and get through this part quickly because I just want to talk about the postcognition. Yeah. If we look at, let's look straight at precognition, because that's an easier way to look at it. A precognitive dream, in some way, I associate to anxiety. Why? Because it has to do with perceiving a lot of patterns about the future. That's one way into it. It's a sort of big topic and I'm not sure how to approach it, but it's something about thinking about the future, right? And there is a way in which you can think about the future where you start imagining a lot of possible things that could happen in the future. And there is a thing that we call anxiety, which I think is like an excess of thinking about the future, which causes a sort of a paralysis and that is perceived as a bad feeling, right? So you start thinking, this could happen or that could happen. And sometimes it might even be good things. You think, if I go there, it's going to be great. But also it could be bad. But also it could be neutral. But also, like, this person might not like me. This person might not want me to be there. Or this person actually is, thinks this about me. And thinking about possible scenarios, right? Things that could happen that aren't actually in any like real way happening, and that's where the paralysis comes from. At some point, so in our conversation, we sort of connected this idea to the way in which this thinking about the future can sometimes hook onto certain contents which are archetypal. So maybe this is a difficult thing to get into, really. The idea is that it leads into psychosis, that anxiety somehow leads into psychosis. That's sort of a feeling, a sense, an idea that I get out of this, because psychosis seems to also have something to do with imagining possible things that are happening. This person actually hates me or something, and specifically about the future. I think this person is coming to get me, right? There's a sense of things that will happen in the future that are bad, but the difference being that it's absolutized. It's about the whole world. It's no longer about a specific social event. In anxiety, there is a way in which you can return back home and the anxiety disappears. Or you can sort of do certain things that alleviate the anxiety. If you're feeling really anxious in the middle of a social event because you feel like everyone's looking at you, or everyone thinking about you in some way, you can go back somewhere else. You can retreat to your safe space. You can be like, no, fuck it. I'm going away. I'm leaving this party. Right? So you can do that. There is a place that is safe from these thoughts. However, I feel like at some point the thoughts become extended to everything. So for example, if you feel that people are thinking about you in a certain way that hurts you at the social event that you're at, and you leave that social event and still you feel like everyone is sort of thinking about you outside, like on the street, for example, and then like, okay, well, I got to get out of here, and you go somewhere where there are no people, but maybe it's like there's a movie playing somewhere, and the movie also has some thematic connection to being observed that you perceive in it, and maybe there's a drawing on the wall that also reminds you of an eye, or is an eye or something, and so you get to this point where no matter how far you retreat from the event that was causing the pain, it's always there. It becomes absolutized. It's everywhere, and so you can't sort of run from it. And in some way, then you're entering into contact with something archetypal, because it has nothing to do with any specific material configuration. Any material configuration could be talking about that. So any group of people could be reminding you of the fact that you're being chased. But also any pattern on the wall, any number on a number plate, any cloud in the sky, anything can be this this being looked at by something. So suddenly what happens there, I think, is that the thing that you're being looked at is no longer human exactly in any specific way. It's divine. You're being looked at by God, right? Basically, right? You're being looked at by some sort of a presence and a person, sort of a self that doesn't really need any specific material body to exist. It can exist in any material body. It can exist in any phenomena, any material behavior in the world. And so you're interacting with that person that is somehow transcendent of the material world and is looking at you. Through those processes, right, I believe, like as a personal sort of belief of mine, that it has something to do quite obviously and intimately with the experience of synchronicity, right? The experience of synchronicity, in some way, you could say, can be experienced in a non-traumatic way. It can be experienced in a sort of like integrated way, let's say, that doesn't lead you to despair and to the feeling that you're being persecuted. How that happens, I'm not entirely sure. How that split happens from a persecutory, sort of paralyzing, badly felt sense of perceiving patterns, and a more sort of integratable experience of perceiving patterns, I'm not exactly sure how that happens, how the difference happens. But it seems to me, so for example, Carl Jung, who seemed basically the main use of the word synchronicity comes from him, kind of explored dreams and synchronicities in this way, in a way that suggested that they have a future content to them. Somehow something about the future. The future is communicated through them. So it kind of connects. This is kind of what I wanted to get at, is that if you're in a state where you're like wondering and ideating about the future again and again, then right, you're ideating about like things that could happen to you, like when you're still, let's say, at the anxiety phase of this, you're like, oh, this social event will be terrible. I know it will. It's going to be terrible, and this is going to happen. Or maybe it's not that I know I will, right? It's more about all sorts of things could happen. It could go well, it could go badly, it could go this way or that way, and there's an overload of possibilities of things that could happen in the future. And it's also like that sort of future-oriented nature of it ends up expanding into like the archetypal space, because you end up perceiving patterns so much that it puts you in contact with some sort of an unconscious force that is getting you in touch with the future in a way that you couldn't have perceived yourself, right? So then, because precisely the experience of synchronicity can lead to this experience, again, it can lead to this experience that's more integratable, where you perceive futures that actually do seem to come true in some way that's beyond what you could have predicted, right? Precognition of this kind. And so, okay, maybe that's enough for this aspect of it, that there's this future-oriented aspect of, let's say, unease that transforms into anxiety, a future-oriented anxiety which transforms into psychosis, which then somehow transforms into the experience of like a potential unification with the precognitive, right? Okay, I was sort of trying to think about what's the opposite of that, because in our conversation with Sing Century, we were talking about also how depression perhaps is in some sort of a tension with this, because it seems to be, okay, bear with me, I know it's getting a bit long, but it's like it seems to be about the past. So whereas anxiety seems to be about thinking a lot about the future and having all sorts of thoughts about what the future could be, and it's terrifying. The past seems to play a role in depression, where what seems to be happening is that you seem to be completely certain of what has happened in the past. Like, you're convinced that the past has been a specific way. You're convinced that that person lied to you, and that this other person did this thing to you, and that this thing that happened in the past was a terrible experience, and that this other thing that happened in the past was also a terrible experience. You're convinced of this, to the point where anything that you may do in the present moment is felt to be completely devoid of any interest. There is no desire to do anything in the present moment, because everything that you could do will simply just, like, you have such a knowledge of the past, of what has happened and how bad everything has been so far in the past, that there is a sense that, well, it kind of creates a body of evidence that makes you think, well, everything will just continue being this way, right? You have this sense of, this history has gone this way, this way, this way. I have had repeated incidents of people, abusing me or being lying. I have multiple sort of instances of this, and so it creates a sort of, again, some sort of like an archetypal space of some kind, where all people just do this. All people do this, So, or all situations turn out badly like this. So, what's the interest in engaging in any situation possible in the world? Right? I feel that therefore it's sort of past oriented. It's always about, this is, I'm certain of the past. I'm certain of what happened in the past. And the way this sort of echoes, the way this connects to postcognition, let's try and get there quickly, is that I think the way that the numinous interacts with this aspect of reality is that I feel like you end up having dreams about the past, whereas anxiety and psychosis lead you towards dreams about the future. And about, let's say, the dreams that give you an information about the future that you couldn't have known. I am wondering, and I'm just wondering about this because I don't even know if I have exactly had that experience, but I wonder if something like this happens the other way around, which is you can have a dream of the past that you didn't know about, which then gets like precognition gets confirmed. Like precognition, you have the dream, and then it gets confirmed. Something shows you that the dream was true. It was pointing to a future event that was actually happening. What if there is this post thing of something that was known in the past, but you didn't have any access to? You gain access to it now. You learn, for example, that a certain person in your past was having a terrible sort of moment back then that you were never aware of because they were hiding it and they never told anyone. And you had no idea about this. And you dream about this and you're like, that's weird, and somehow it gets confirmed. Maybe someone tells you, hey, did you know that this person just revealed to everyone that this thing happened to them in their past? And you're like, oh wow, I just sort of was aware of that before it happened, before the revelation happened in my life at least. Or maybe someone just told me just now after I had the dream. It's very similar to precognition in a sense, because it still is, let's say, a dream that contains cognition. It's in a sense, it is no different from precognition, maybe technically, because it is cognition that you are having before having it. So it's still stuff that you didn't know that you then know. So you didn't know this stuff. You then know it after the dream. And it confirms that the dream was somehow pointing to something real that you wouldn't have ever known. The difference being that here, what is being pointed at is the past instead of the future. It's not future events that haven't happened yet. It's past events that already have happened, but that you could have never known about, or that you just didn't know about, and that are very specific even. So I believe those two kind of dreams could happen. In a way, I think they're the same kind of experience in some sense. And what does this do? What does this do exactly, right? Well, in a psychosis, what I thought is that what's happening is that the anxiety gets absolutized, right? The anxiety was localized. It only related to a specific social event. But then it becomes absolutized. Every single situation in your life is this situation of being observed, of having this bad experience. And maybe with depression, the same thing happens, but in a different way, where depression maybe can lead to something else that is also the psychotic sort of equivalent, which is absolutized. I have not read on any of this really, so I don't know what the names for these things might be exactly, but the name that I feel intuitively to give to it would be just some sort of paranoid state, some paranoid awareness, paranoia of some kind, in which if before the depression transforms into a sort of absolute state in which everyone becomes the same person. Okay, this is what I mean. And I'm going to try and explain this. With psychosis, a specific thing happens, right? Which is, there was someone at the party, there was someone at the social event who you felt you were being looked at, stared at by this person. You felt stared at by this person. And then you go home and you continue to feel stared at. Not by this person, but by a different person. By a different poster on the wall. By a different clock on your hand. By a different movie on the wall. By a different... all sorts of different things. And a single entity, a single staring person has become like an infinite multiplicity of people who are staring at you. You're being stared now by an infinite amount of people. 1 million people. I think the opposite is happening with depression, which is that before you were being stared at, or you felt you were being lied to by everyone, or by a lot of people, right? Like every interaction sucks, you know. There's no point in engaging in interactions because every interaction ends up just being some sort of a deceit where you're getting hurt. And it's all different. You know, there's that time that person did it, there's that time in the past when this other thing happened, there's this other time in the past, and you have a huge backlog of an infinite amount of times when this happened. And it's all separate people. At some point, though, it's like they get converged into a single person who's in front of you, so that the person in front of you, no matter who that person is, or even the situation, the material situation in front of you, no matter what situation it is, becomes an embodiment of all possible situations. And so that person can't do anything to escape the archetype that they have become sort of devoured by. So, for example, if someone in front of you says something to you that's like super like accepting of you and super kind, and they really like take you into consideration, and there's like a beautiful gesture on their part, and there's all sorts of things that maybe in a state of just like normal depression could have felt like potential things that sort of break the cracks, that kind of potentially could make you think like, oh, okay, maybe some moments are more or less okay. So maybe some moments are okay. Maybe some moments are not bad, right? But I think that if you enter into this psychotic state of paranoia, of this state of this like numinous state, anyone, no matter how interesting they are, no matter how, let's say, how much they listen to you and they are there for you in some way, it can be perceived as evidence of something bad. Like, yeah, you're listening to me, but it's just because then you can manipulate me later, right? Yeah, of course you're listening to me. Of course you're like giving me all this space and everything. But it's just because then, you can gain something from it. You then, it serves you to manipulate me, or it serves you to manipulate others. So that anything, and I think it can then extend beyond people as well in some way. So anything, any painting on the wall will be like, yeah, okay, that painting could just be some way in which people are trying to hurt each other. It's a painting that's just an expression of a manipulative will. There is sort of no way that anything could be perceived as being ethical or wholesome in any way, in some way. That's one way to describe it, I guess. I am not super familiar with this exactly, with these symptoms, but this would be one way of describing it. And I think that so that the person in front of you is like an embodiment of the archetypal person who hurts you. So there's no way they can escape that. No matter what they do, it will always be used, it will always be perceived as something that's part of this archetype of someone who hurts you. In the same way that, for example, in the psychosis, if you look at something that reminds you of a pair of eyes, it will be a pair of eyes, right? And it can really be as separate and as different from a pair of eyes as possible. It could just be like two numbers on a wall, and you're like, yeah, that's two eyes, or it could be the sky is suddenly like a greenish color, and you're like, oh yeah, green, that's like the color of envy, and envy has something to do with looking enviously, so the sky is eyes, right? The color green gets transformed into eyes, or even anything that, let's say, could have no connection to eyes, potentially, also ends up having some connection to eyes, because you're in the face of an archetype. So it doesn't really matter what the material configuration is, the archetype becomes stronger. So with depression and with paranoia in this case, I think that something similar kind of happens, which is you're in front of a single person who has now absorbed all of the possible people who could have potentially hurt you in the past, or could have potentially done something to you. And so there's no way they can exit that. Now, that is why I think the archetypal enters into play and enters into this mode of numinosity, the numinous mode, in which, because these numinous dreams, or these dreams of precognition about the future, or precognition about the past, are, I think, the way in which this spell is broken, basically. Because they are the way in which you can be shown without a shadow of a doubt that something is wrong. So, for example, you're convinced of a bunch of plans about the future, a million different dreams about the future. The future could be this, that, the other. And you're like sort of really wrapped up in that sort of psychotic thinking of like, all of these things could happen in the future. But then you're blown in the face with a dream that shows you like an actual thing that actually happens in a way that you couldn't have possibly known. So suddenly it's like something trustworthy enters into your life. Before, something untrustworthy was everywhere. Everything was untrustworthy. Suddenly something comes into your life that's like, I don't know how I could have known that, but somehow I was sort of communicated some truth, then became true, shown to me, something like that, right? And I think that breaks the spell. Whenever that happens, it breaks the spell, because suddenly it's like, oh, the future isn't exactly how I see it. It's how, like, there's a crack, there's a crack in which, in which, like, your perception of the future starts to come into doubt, right? Which in this case is like a way in which you can start thinking that, oh, well, maybe all these things I have about the future, these things that I'm thinking about, are not super true, because they are juxtaposed to this dream which was super true. You know what I mean? It enters into like a little bit of a shadow of doubt. Something, therefore, I think perhaps could be happening also in the same way with depression, in that this dream that shows you something about the past that you didn't know, it shows you something that you didn't know and that you couldn't have known, right? And so it breaks your certainty about the past. You were super certain that, for example, everything that happened in the past was super bad. That person was like so mean, was super mean to you in the past. But maybe you have a dream that shows you something that you didn't know about that situation and that you couldn't possibly have known. That maybe that person was having a really horribly difficult situation in their life, in a horribly difficult circumstance that you didn't know. And maybe it's a circumstance that when you see it, you're like, you empathize with it. Like, yeah, I understand this situation that this person was going through. And it sort of breaks this sense of, oh, maybe they weren't mean to me just because, or maybe not because of the reasons that I thought. Maybe my reasons were not so complete. Maybe I didn't really know that much, right? It doesn't necessarily sort of make the past any more complex or any less complex. It just sort of shows you that, oh, it's different from what I was convinced about the past. Maybe what it does is sort of, it adds a context that you couldn't have known. Like, oh, okay, the past can be seen differently than what I thought. You suddenly discover the past in a way that you didn't know. Maybe you have some sort of, again, postcognitive, precognitive, whatever word, some sort of numinous weird dream about the past that shows you that some person that you thought was actually being super rude to you actually had feelings for you, and you had no idea, right? And maybe that's somehow that influenced their behavior towards you, that maybe their rudeness towards you was sort of connected to their feelings to you, right? And it makes you see it in a different way. And the point of the numinosity of these dreams is not just that this is like just some fantasy's dream that you have, but that it can get confirmed later. So you maybe have this dream that gives you this information that you couldn't have known, and maybe the next day, the following days, this information comes to you in the actual material world. Like, someone actually tells you, or this person, like, maybe out of the blue sends you a message 10 years later relating to this issue or whatever. And then you're like, okay, not only have I gained this information through the material world, not only has someone told me this in the material world, which, if they'd told me, I could have chosen to trust it or not trust it, right? If I had been in a really bad state, I might have been like, no, you're just lying to me. Like, this is not true. You're just manipulating me with that knowledge, right? You could have just had the dream, and you've woken up and been like, that's a dumb dream. That's just my dreams and desires showing up in a dream. Like, how, that's dumb, you know? But when both of them show up at the same time, in conjunction, then you're like, oh, what's happening? If it happens multiple times, and it happens like in degrees of sort of depth and complexity about what's being communicated that are like beyond what you could have imagined or believed possible as being like empirically accessible, then something happens in you. You're like, oh, okay. There is some way in which knowledge of the past can be had that is somehow beyond what I could have before. Before, I was like reigning supreme over the past. I knew everything about the past, and no one could convince me otherwise. I had complete, absolute sort of certainty. Something comes in and it's like, maybe the past was not exactly what you thought it was. Maybe even your feelings towards the past are not what you think they are. Maybe other people's feelings towards the past are not what you think they are. Maybe other people's thoughts and actions are different from what you thought. Maybe it all means something different, etc., etc., right? And you're like, okay, well, I was convinced that I knew the past, that I knew all this stuff, and now it's like something comes in that says, well, maybe not. And it can come in because of this numinosity, because of the numinous aspect of it. Because otherwise you're trapped in a loop. Otherwise you're really trapped in a complete like loop of paranoia. Because the loop of paranoia is sort of solipsistic. Because no one can get into it. No one, no matter what people say to you from the outside, no matter what things happen, it's always just going to be like, oh no, they're just trying to lie to me. They're just trying to manipulate me. You know, there is a way in which it gets locked up, and with its opposite, with anxiety and psychosis, a similar thing happens, right? Which is you sort of start feeling that everything is looking at you. Everything is a pair of eyes, for example, that is looking at you. No matter if something presents itself to you that is obviously not a pair of eyes, or that is obviously not in that context, or that, let's say, offers the possibility of interpreting itself as not being that, offers the possibility of some sort of an interaction with a self that is not trying to manipulate you. No, it will be a self who is looking at you, who is studying you, who is observing you, and has like a malicious, something that's perceived as a malicious sort of will. Right, so both of these states end up into this weird solipsistic bubble. And so it's weird because in this bubble then what happens is that this bubble simultaneously is like, this bubble is like it's the conditions under which you can even, it's the conditions under which you can perceive the archetypes. Because now everything becomes absolutized, and therefore everything kind of becomes transcended from the material realm, right? So something stops being inherently connected to the material world, to any specific material shape, and it's then that numinous aspect, that numinous sort of part of it, which sort of well, you know what I've been saying now, right? It talks to you, and then it kind of offers you a way out through trusting it, and through trusting its knowledge in some way. So yeah, I guess that was part of it. Some thoughts on postcognition, or like the ways in which the poles of depression and anxiety map out into the past and the future, and ways in which we think about the past and the future in ways that obsess us, and how this sort of resolves itself in some way, and why it resolves itself. And I don't know when it resolves itself, right? That is a mystery, right? The when is like, no, I don't know, right? I don't know when that happens, because sometimes you can just be trapped in that bad state and not kind of feel like you're getting out, but it's like sometimes the potential for that for that escape route opens up, and you don't know exactly when. Perhaps also because knowing the when implies the future somehow, and it implies a sort of precisely a kind of a form of future that you are communicated by the numinosity. That doesn't make sense, but anyway, something along those lines. I hope it made sense in some way at least. And yeah, so the when is still a mystery. That's the thing. It's to be interested by and to think about. So yeah, thanks. Hope it wasn't like, I don't know what something. Blah blah blah. Bye bye. Yes, goodbye.